There is a single thing in your company that's a bottleneck. There is one weakest link in the chain. We have a lot of links in the chain. We have a shop, we have equipment, we have materials, we have labor, we have overhead. But almost everybody, if you're into landscape contracting that's listening to this, has probably got their weakest link of the chain is field labor. If I had more great crews and great crew leads, I could do more work, but that's my problem. I can't hire, find, train, etc. that many people. And so Throughput looks at maximizing that particular thing and basically says an improvement anywhere else is almost a mirage. So if your improvement isn't helping your labor be more productive, assuming that's your constraint, then it's not really an improvement at all.
You're watching the LeanScaper podcast, where landscapers come to grow. If you want the systems, stories, and strategies to build a lean, mission-driven company that your team loves working for, keep watching. Mike, it is so good to see you. Welcome to your first episode of the LeanScaper podcast. How are you?
Hey, Benji, very good. First of a couple, I hope.
First of a few. So we're going to have this awesome conversation. I'm really excited about today's conversation because we're going to sort of cut through the complexity and the noise in a way and give our listeners an easier way to think about, track, and hold tension to profitability in their business by using some new ratios, some new calculations, a slightly newer lens to look at efficiency and profitability in their companies. But I thought we'd start here, just quickly, why can the traditional gross profit and net profit metrics that we're all very familiar with sometimes be really misleading for owners?
It's a good, it's a different perspective for a lot of owners, certainly different from a lot of accountants. But gross profit and net profit can be misleading because they're based on certain assumptions that are just not true in real life. And by the way, as we talk about this, I'm not saying any of it is bad. I want to make that really clear. It's really good, obviously, to know what your gross profit is and your net profit. So I really want to make sure that
we're not saying to stop tracking that
Exactly.
at all. We're just sort of adding a new layer of refinement to how we look at it.
Exactly that. Yeah. And so why is profit, can it be misleading? I think two things. Number one, the idea that saving costs is going to increase your profit has made a lot of people make bad decisions or make insufficient decisions where they could have made investments to grow their revenue quicker. Buying equipment is the easiest one, right? Hey, that's going to cost us $600,000 a month in a lease. Well, when I look at it like that, I'm not really looking at the other side of the equation, which is how much more productive is this going to make me? How much more revenue can I generate? I'm cost focused. And that's the formula, right? Gross profit, net profit, it's going to subtract that expense. So we'll take a look at how to look at that a different way. And then the other thing I think that's misleading in a way is that overhead is calculated to be on a job level through an assumption that we're going to recoup some overhead based on costs to get there. Now, again, I really want to make it clear, this is so much better than not having anything, right? Than wild guessing. This is what you should do. I just think there's another evolution to that, which says, hey, look, a lot of overhead, and I would argue even things like labor and equipment, they don't change because we didn't get this job or we did get this job. We've still got people to pay. We don't lay people off at 3:00. We don't lay people off day to day. We have to make sure that we recoup this. So although they're not fixed costs, genuinely, we should think of labor and equipment more like fixed costs. And what we're going to talk about today is going to do a little bit of that. And in a really easy way. I think the couple formulas that we'll talk about today are arguably easier than a whole bunch of formulas that we could look at. But I definitely think they'll help add another lens that'll make better decisions. So again, not saying gross and net should go away. It's another way to look at gross and net that I think will help make better decisions.
We're supplementing those two metrics with some newer dimensions that are going to give you better information to make decisions from. One of the things that you're really known for, Mike, on the team, with the people you lead, is really having an incredible lens on efficiency, particularly operational efficiency. I'm wondering if quickly you can just share a little bit about your journey in developing that. I don't think that you were born that way, although you may have had some, talents or gifting or, you're set up to have this skill. But I know that you would have learned a lot of this along the way throughout your career. Tell us a bit about that. Some of the big shifts, some of the big realizations, maybe some specific projects or challenges you went through to kind of have the lens on efficiency that you do now.
That's a good question. Yeah, nothing earth shattering. I think the first place I really got exposed to efficiency is I worked in a giant steel plant right out of school. As an IT guy, I wrote software that read the steel slats as they came through the factory and got sliced up into bars and axles and everything that you use steel for today. Super interesting place. One of the only mills where they literally take the coke from like a mill and put it all the way to a finished axle, all in one place. Like pretty awesome to look at. Spectacular, molten steel and all that kind of stuff. Now, unionized place, and there's a whole lot of things that weren't very efficient about it, but it was assembly line type of manufacturing. And so there was a lot of things about efficiency. One of my first jobs was like writing software that read it. We read the temperature and certain properties of steel 200 times a second to make sure that everything was optimized as that steel went down. That was, I think, my first taste of it. I started reading books. One of my favorites, like The Goal by Ellie Goldratt. And he's written so many books that sort of changed my life and the way I looked at efficiency. They're old. They're like from the 80s, but they're brilliant. And some of his advice to bakers and clothing makers and whatever is just absolutely simple and brilliant. And I'd encourage people to check that out. But it was that. Like, I'd watch his talks and I just like, that's such a cool way of looking at it. And I got excited about that. And then I got into Toyota because they're known for their manufacturing process. And then I met Mark when I was coming on to be his director of operations, and he knew about the Toyota way, and he had a background in a nuclear plant, which was also driven by efficiency. And I think there was just a synergy there. And we were like, great, let's figure this out for landscaping. And we did. Yeah.
So there's two ratios here that you're going to share. One is called labor efficiency ratio. The other is called labor expense ratio. They're certainly very related to each other. Just define both and show how they're related for us.
Sure. I'll just put the formula up right on the screen there so you can see it. Okay. Yeah, it's a very simple formula, the labor efficiency ratio. And the labor expense ratio is just like the inverse of that. So it's same formula, same numbers. One has revenue on the top, one has revenue on the bottom. It's a really easy way at looking at, I would say, productivity all rolled up. And what it does is, if you're looking at your labor efficiency ratio, we're going to take revenue and put it at the top of the equation. We're going to divide that by the cost of your field labor payroll. So just the people that work in the field, not the people in your overhead or your office, just the people in the field. And what that really looks at by dividing those two is per dollar spent of payroll labor in the field, how much revenue can we generate? So we, typically look for about a 4-to-1 ratio on that, but that depends. Maintenance is not going to be anywhere near that high. Design build can be that, could be better on certain lines of work, but as a general rule, that one's pretty close.
By the way, I'm just going to interject. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, you don't have access to this. But if you're listening on Spotify, you can open the app and see the video. Mike's got some stuff on screen. And if you're watching on YouTube, obviously you see this already. But there is kind of a visual component to this, if that helps. If you're just listening along, you should be able to get all this anyway. But I just wanted to flag that for listeners. Didn't mean to interrupt. Carry on, Mike.
No, you're good. And I think as we get in later, it might help. So if you've got access to that, I'd throw it up. The other side of that is your labor expense ratio, and it's just the opposite of what I just described. Now we put field labor payroll on the top, and we divide it by revenue, and that shows us for every dollar spent, for every dollar earned in revenue, what percent gets spent on the payroll costs. And so if if I said it was a 4-to-1 ratio before, this would look more like 25%. And I want to know that I spend 25% of every dollar I make on field payroll wages. And if that drops, we're getting more productive, right? We're generating more revenue per dollar spent. And if it goes up, I'm getting less productive. And so it's a great thermometer on how productive our team is.
What does good look like? Can you give us some benchmarks? I think, by the way, most people are familiar with the expense ratio because they would see some version of that in a P&L or a job costing tool. They're going to be shown that. But I feel certainly in my business experience, less familiar with the ratio where you're sort of showing this almost like a revenue multiple. It's like, hey, if I put X dollars into labor, I'm going to get Y dollars out in revenue. And on that one, are there benchmarks that you can share? Like what does good look like? What should people be striving for? Obviously, this is going to change a little bit market to market and then a lot service to service. So it's going to be difficult to give a perfect formula. But in broad strokes, what are some good benchmarks there?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple broad strokes. So good in, let's talk about the markets. The biggest differentiator isn't necessarily your geographic market. That has some differentiation, but surprisingly less than you would think. I'll come back to that one in a second when it makes more sense. Your biggest differentiator is your service line. When you're doing stuff like construction or anything where, like, planting is another great example, irrigation installations, another great example. Whenever we're using materials, we're padding revenue with a whole lot of income from materials. And so those services are going to be a much higher labor efficiency ratio than something else, than something that's like digging or mowing where there's not materials. So when you're looking at benchmarks in that, a 4-to-1 ratio in landscape design build is good, is solid. You know, a 5-to-1 is pretty outstanding. And after that, you should probably continue to try to achieve a 5-to-1 by bringing up the wages. That was sort of the story of TBG. We watched this ratio. That's the landscape company, for those of you who don't know, that we ran operations for. We watched this ratio and it started to get better. And well, first, let's say when the owner, Mark, worked in the business, it was really good because he and his brother were hyper productive and hyper focused on generating it. As we replaced them with employees as crew managers, everything started to go downhill. They were cheaper, but our revenue dropped by more than the wages dropped as a percentage because the productivity just wasn't there. So we could see our number coming down. And then as we started training better and hiring better and getting actually better foremen in, more expensive crew leads in, we saw that number start to go to get better again. That labor efficiency ratio started to climb. And then so our optimal was about, like I said, between 20 and 25%. If labor is 20 to 25% of an expense of your revenue, which, to put it the other way, is like between a 4 and a 5, if you're looking at labor efficiency ratio, those are good numbers to have.
What about for service or maintenance?
Yeah, you're looking at like somewhere between a 2.5 to a 3.5 ratio, depending on how much enhancements you do. So if you don't do a lot of enhancements, you don't have very much materials at all, you're mostly service driven, like a ratio of like 2.5 is going to be a lot closer to reality. If you do some maintenance with a bit of enhancements and you count that with your maintenance division, then you could be pushing, 3.5. Depends on how much of that you do. But those are good benchmarks.
Yeah, there's something interesting here where the more material you're able to pass through and mark up to the customer, the better your ratio is going to be. And so when you look at, there's landscaping examples like construction versus service, but then if you looked more broadly at the trades, there's also other like really great available examples. Like I've always really loved siding businesses, for example, because they pass through a ton of materials to the customer. I've never really been interested in like window cleaning or pressure washing businesses because there aren't that many materials that you can pass through to the customer. Now, there's other efficiencies and other pros and cons of every single industry, but if we're just looking at ways to optimize a labor efficiency ratio, one big lever to pull is obviously like, hey, how many materials are flowing through this system towards the customer? And that's obviously going to boost this ratio for us, correct?
100%. If you're talking about other things like solar panels on your roof are great examples. Massive material expense, not a whole lot of labor, right? There's labor, but it's not a whole lot. And so if you can, for the same number of people, generate that much more revenue per hour, per day, just imagine what that adds up to at the end of the year. It allows you to, a solar company arguably has the same shop, has similar office salaries, has similar insurance. They pay the same for QuickBooks. They pay the same for their accountant. All those things stay true, but the volume of revenue they can bring in from the materials, even if it's not marked up a ton, even if it's just reasonably marked up, is still way greater than, to your point, pressure washing or like a really heavy service related business.
What are the other, so I mentioned the materials. Are there other other levers that we can pull to drive the ratio up or drive the percentage down?
Sure. Subcontractors would be the other obvious one, but that's really almost too obvious. Yes, if I sub work, I'm going to be able to do that. The other one's equipment. So labor ratios and equipment ratios play off each other. And the more I can equip my crews with equipment that makes them faster, lift heavier, move faster, dig faster, whatever it is, the more that labor ratio is going to come down because we're able to do more work with less people as the equipment steps in and takes that work over for them, which is something that is hard to see with like a net profit or a gross profit to our conversation earlier.
You sort of mentioned that these are a step in the right direction, but they're still pretty limited, right? So how are these still kind of limited, and how does that lead us to this core concept for today, which you want to talk about being throughput?
Yeah, so it's a one-dimensional look at something. It's like revenue divided by field labor wage. And so we're looking at two really important things. We're looking at how much sales we're going to bring in. We're looking at the cost of the wages. But there's a couple things that are missing that we need to look at or we want to look at. One of them would be hours, right? And the reason that is important, and one of the reasons I think gross and net profit get there's a bit of a myth there, is like in accounting, we can look at things like our wage. It doesn't really tell us that our field labor wage is actually one of the biggest constraints in our business. It's a bottleneck. I can only get so many people to do this work. Go back to the landscaping example, go to the solar panel example, right? I can order as many solar panels as I need, arguably, right? They'll just keep manufacturing them. I cannot find an infinite number of solar panel installers. I cannot find, if you're listening to this and you're a landscape contractor, an infinite number of crew leads and crew people that know how to do landscaping jobs from start to scratch. And so it becomes super important for us to look at things like hours, as we'll get to in a minute, so that how can I deploy the people that I do have, or another way to look at it, the constraint that I have, how can I get around that constraint by maximizing how much we can bring in per hour worked?
So this is really important. I want to slow down here. The accounting terminology, like variable expense, sort of baked into that definition is the idea that these expenses are variable. They go up, they throttle down with the growth of your business, which is true on paper, but not necessarily true in reality. Labor, like you said, is not super easy to throttle up because we all are dealing with a labor shortage that's a decade plus old now. It's extremely challenging to find skilled crews. So it's actually really hard to throttle up. And like something you said earlier, it's actually kind of hard to throttle down because if you have a job that maybe doesn't take them a full week, it's not like you can just lay these people off and not pay them, because you don't have a full day for them. Like a lot of the times are confronted by the fact that this variable expense isn't actually as variable as the pure definition makes it seem. And so that's why we need to index on some of these other metrics, these other KPIs, these other ratios that Mike's going to share, because it allows us to factor that nuance in. Is that a good sort of way to capture this idea, Mike?
Yeah, there's two things that I really want to look at that. One is whether adding labor, not easy. Possible, but not easy. I got to find it, train it, keep it, whatever. Also, to your point, subtracting labor. Great. It's hard to get them to quit early. If I keep giving people 34, 32, 30-hour work weeks, I'm just going to lose my staff. And we can't really ramp week to week like that. I know at some points in the year, we got to have extras for spring cleanup, or we might be busy in summer and less busy in winter. But to be honest, that's causing us a bunch of problems. That's not easy to solve. That's the problem. That's why this industry likely has a lot of trouble recruiting trades, because it treats labor like variable. But if you treat labor like a variable expense, you're not going to have very consistent, good, well-trained labor. The other side of that, well, we'll get into when we talk about throughput. I'll save that one for a sec. But yeah,
let's get into throughput. Throughput 101. Give us the definition, the explanation, why this thing matters.
Awesome. So throughput, if you read a book like I talked about earlier called The Goal by Ellie Goldratt, and then there's also a follow-up book, it's called Theory of Constraints by Ellie Goldratt. And it's manufacturing based. And so I want to start it there, but we'll talk about why it applies to us just equally well. But it really looks at like, there is a single thing in your company that's a bottleneck. There is one weakest link in the chain. We have a lot of links in the chain. We have a shop, we have equipment, we have materials, we have labor, we have overhead. But almost everybody, if you're into landscape contracting that's listening to this, has probably got their weakest link of the chain is field labor. If I had more great crews and great crew leads, I could do more work, but that's my problem. I can't hire, find, train, etc. that many people. And so Throughput looks at maximizing that particular thing and basically says an improvement anywhere else is almost a mirage. So if your improvement isn't helping your labor be more productive, assuming that's your constraint, then it's not really an improvement at all. The best way to think about this, or the way I found to think about this, can you see my thing there? There was something I picked up at the steel company. Let's assume we've got an assembly line of cars. I will try to explain it out loud for those who aren't necessarily watching. We'll make it simple. We'll say there are 4 stages to an assembly line that's manufacturing a car. The first thing is the assembly of the frame. And let's assume we could do 100 cars an hour on the frame assembly. Once the frame is assembled, we can assemble the body. That's putting like the sheets of steel on it. And let's say that can do 80 cars an hour. I got to get a thinner marker there. And then we got to paint. And let's say it takes a while to paint this frame and body. And so we can do 50 cars an hour. And then the last thing is we put on the bumper and the headlights and all the plastic trim and all that. So that's our trim assembly. And again, we can do maybe 120 trims an hour with our assembly line. So all Throughput is saying is this: if we go, so we got 180, 50, 120 in that order. If we go make and buy a great new frame assembly machine that now makes our frame assembly 120% better, so maybe do 120 an hour, we haven't improved anything because the problem is the paint station. We're still only getting 50 cars an hour painted. And that's where they're saying like everything else is a mirage. We need to focus on what our biggest constraint is.
This is really profound and sort of like ties into, there's so many lessons here. Okay. So there's a saying from the great Paul Akers who wrote 2 Second Lean. His sort of like chief mantra is fix what bugs you. And that's sort of like a personalized version of this same concept. But what he's saying in a clever sentence is basically deal with the thing that's the actual issue. And what you're illustrating with this diagram and the numbers is that fixing the frame assembly, improving the body assembly, or getting a more efficient trim assembly process is a colossal waste of time because you're still bottlenecked by the paint in this example. But there's going to be a landscaping equivalent. There's going to be a personal finance equivalent. There's going to be a personal health equivalent. That's why I say this is profound. This whole concept applies sort of like a universal law that you can observe and see everywhere. And I think what happens, Mike, I do this all the time. We work together. You can probably see this. I'm like classic. I'll just go and make the frame assembly better because that's what I like to do. When in reality, it's like you do need to be quite cerebral and intellectually honest about, am I just making a thing that I like better, or am I actually attacking the true bottleneck in the system? And that's the part that I think is quite difficult to be honest with yourself about, because we have our own bias and our own preferences. We have the opinions of others. We've got podcasts we're listening to and books we're reading that are filling our head with ideas. But this is like the cleanest way to sort of cut through the noise and look at your entire business like an assembly line, which, I mean, is that like a useful way to just, is that the lens? Is that how we should be looking at things kind of permanently in our companies?
Yes. And I want to make that as simple as possible. So I'm not also, it's harder in landscape contracting. It's not an assembly line where things go really neatly from A to Z, but we can all usually admit our biggest problem is labor. And so, yeah, I would say like focusing on things that solve that bottleneck is exactly what it is. And what you said is like spot on. Just think about like, people that want to look better. physically, right? Well, if I don't fix eating, it really doesn't matter how much I work out, I'm going to have a body problem, right? And this applies to everything. I want to make it so that we can assume that field labor is our biggest constraint. We could change that though, if you don't feel that way. We'll get into a formula that makes this so that I don't have to think about it. Cause you're right, Benji, as human beings, we gravitate to the things that we like looking at and doing. Equipment is a great example, right? I like equipment. So I got a nice shop and I got this and I got hoists and I sharpening tools and I got a mechanic in there. Oh, now I got 3 mechanics in there. That would be all well and good if that's what you need to maximize your labor. But if your labor is not maximized, a lot of that is an illusion. And we should focus on that first.
So interesting. So what is the actual like calculation for throughput then?
So there's a couple of different calculations. One I'm going to put up is the strict definition of throughput. But what I really want to do is look at, well, how do I look at this as a landscape company? How do I look at this as both my company, but also how do I look at this at a job to help my sales team, my estimators, to help us set standards for jobs so that we can do work well. I could even take these numbers that I'm going to show you because they're dead simple and even provide those to crews to be like, that's where we need to hit. And there's nothing in there that you're going to be worried about secretive or anything like that. It's really straightforward. And it's a cool number that just says like, that's where we should be on this job. So the strict definition of throughput is this: your revenue minus your truly variable costs. That might sound like the same as gross profit, but it's not. The key word there is truly. The way throughput looks at it is your truly variable costs are, as we talked earlier, the things that actually are variable, and it doesn't assume that your labor and your equipment is variable, right? Your equipment's leased, you own it, whatever. You can't sell equipment and buy equipment that month. No different than you can get rid of your labor and bring it back on any given week so they don't actually count that as truly variable costs. Your truly variable costs are your material costs. It is the cost of things like subcontractors, permits, rentals, other stuff like that. I like to think of it the easiest ways, money that flows outside of your company. So payroll does flow kind of outside your company at the end of the day, but not really, right? Like payroll is the people that are in your company getting paid. So I don't consider that money flowing out. When you look at revenue minus truly variable costs, your truly variable costs should be the cost, not the price, but the cost of like what you pay your vendors essentially to get this job done. And then if we take that a step further, when I said like, well, how do we relate this to whatever? We just simply divide that per hour worked on a job, or for all our field labor hours in a year, if I want to look at that as company. And that shows us how much revenue we are retaining per hour or per year, if we want to look at it that way, for everything we do. So after vendors are all paid, how much money do we have left? If I can maximize that number, no matter how I do it, I am going to be in good shape. And it will change the type of how it is going to change how jobs look.
So is there are you saying there's like a throughput per hour calculation, or like, is that I see the revenue minus truly variable costs thing, but you're adding a time component to this as well.
Correct. I am looking at throughput per hour as an easy lens, especially for jobs. We could do this. Throughput on its own is a good number. It shows us how much money's flowing through the system. But if you want to make it about your biggest constraint, that's where we add the hour in, right? Hours are our constraint. The hours is how many hours do I have available to work? And if I can maximize my throughput, which is money retained after we pay our vendors per hour worked, I'm going to be in good shape. And it's going to be, in my opinion, a number that is, if not equally as valuable as gross profit, more valuable. But I'm not saying gross profit isn't.
What is this throughput per hour like at the end of the day in plain English? Like, let's just sort of like drop the manufacturing talk for a second. In plain English, like throughput per hour is meant to show us what, and we are meant to do exactly what with that information now that we have it.
Throughput per hour, really simple, shows us how much revenue is retained by the business. And then the per hour is per hour worked. And it's that simple. And so if we can sell jobs that maximize throughput per hour, if we can use routing that maximizes throughput per hour. There's a bunch of different ways to look at it. And certainly if we can execute jobs in a way that maximizes throughput per hour, it's just a lot of good things are going to happen, right? How do we maximize the revenue that our company retains per hour worked? That just should sound exciting right there. It's really, and that's what I'm saying. It's not that complicated. It's arguably less complicated than gross or net profit because it really just looks at two simple things. And if I can keep as much as possible per hour worked, I will have more money to pay crews. I will have more money to buy equipment. I will have more money to invest in the business. And we can look at, those formulas as well. As it takes a little bit further, it counts things as investments. So you can look at, well, what's our throughput divided by our investment, which is our fixed expenses like a shop and like our fleet and et cetera. But to keep it simple for this conversation, I'd just like to stay here.
So can you think of a few more, let's just go through a few more examples specific to the landscaping context where throughput per hour is maximized. You mentioned routing, or we select these jobs over those jobs, or we market towards these customers over those customers because they give us the highest likelihood of having a throughput per hour that we're really happy with. Just to really color in the point, what would be some real world, tangible, relatable examples that our listeners can kind of understand and see in their own business?
All right. So I'm going to take us through sort of three myths that I think are perpetuated or even encouraged when you look at old accounting, or I shouldn't say old accounting, but traditional accounting, and then how Throughput looks at this differently. I think equipment is the first big one. So if you look at the traditional definition of accounting, equipment is a cost. And so your lease cost, your fuel cost, your insurance cost, et cetera.
And so we should naturally try to get rid of those, just going with the old definition. If we're just going off of the overly simplified sort of accounting heuristic there, it's cost equals bad, get rid of it as much as you can. And you're trying to make a much more nuanced point about how to understand that.
100%. Yeah, because I think in a lot of businesses, equipment was seen as too expensive, right? We'll share an excavator. I won't give one to each crew, or I can't afford this excavator. I'm going to dig. Or I can't afford this Trimble unit for the excavator that digs precisely, because all these things have a cost that if I want to maintain profit, I need to minimize. And I'd say this might have hurt the industry more than anything. When I look at the wages I pay the people that work for us, right? I'm encouraged to pay the least amount of wages. That will maximize my profit. Well, if you only look at cost, it will, but not if you look at throughput. If you're just saying all people execute the amount of work equally, then that would be true. But that is not true. Better paid people, in theory, generate more revenue. And that thing doesn't necessarily assume all that, or when we look at it from a cost cutting. And honestly, I think for years, that's hurt the industry. We have hired the people that we can hire for the cheapest because we don't have maybe an elevated view. And I'm not saying it's not right there. If you properly look at accounting and see revenue and gross profit and net profit, there is a relationship there. It's just not obvious. And it's not easy for people to understand. So I think one is certainly throughput, again, by us just looking at revenue minus the cost of the materials and vendor things divided by the hour worked. That's not necessarily encouraging us to cut labor costs. It's not even looking at it at all, in a sense. It's looking at the hours we're working, but it's maximizing that. Let me show you a real example, which I think illustrates it pretty well. For those of you, again, listening, this will make more sense if you fire up the video, as we'll show you an example. But if I look at 100 hours of mowing work and the traditional gross profit, if I look at 100 hours of mowing and we pay for 100 hours of mowing, let's say an average of $25 an hour, doesn't matter what yours is exactly, but close enough, then our cost is $2,500, right? 100 hours, $25 an hour. And if we charge that mowing out at $50 an hour, then great, we've got that. And so it's $5,000 in billing. And so when I do that math, I'm looking at a gross profit of something in the neighborhood of 50%, or 50% exactly in this case. So that actually looks really good. Anything at the gross profit at 50% is pretty healthy. I would consider that good. And then if we look at hardscape work, and it's going to be a little more nuanced here because we're going to have material costs. But if I look at hardscape having 100 hours of work, My wages are probably going to be a bit higher for a hardscape crew. So we'll say $30 an hour. So that's $3,000 in wages. And then we look at a higher rate as well. Maybe we charge $65 an hour for hardscape installs. So that's $6,500 in revenue earned at $100 an hour. I'm sorry, at $65 an hour. And then we're going to have materials, right? So let's say the materials for the hardscape project cost us $8,000, and we're going to mark them up. So we get $11,000. Now I'll save you all the math, but if we add this up, which is basically your material revenue and plus your labor revenue, which is about $17,500, and just to simplify things, Benji, we'll just forget equipment and that kind of stuff right now. We'll just keep it super simple. It's $17,500 in revenue. The cost is $11,000, both labor and materials. And so that gross profit is about 38%, roughly. I think it's 37 and a decimal point. So we look at these two things like mowing and hardscape. And if I'm gross profit focused, it appears to me that mowing is the better gross profit. And honestly, if you had an infinite supply of people, I guess it would be, but we don't. And so if you look at things like throughput, it's a different lens. Throughput looks at, again, the revenue earned minus the expenses divided by the number of hours. So if I look at the throughput for mowing, there are no materials. The revenue earned is $5,000. And so because I have no materials, I have nothing to subtract. So it's just 5,000 divided by 100 hours, which is $50 an hour in throughput. If I look at it the other way, and I'll even write this formula down here a little bit, our material revenue plus our labor revenue is about $17,500. That's what we said we were going to get on this job. Now we need to minus the material cost, the cost of the hardscapes, because that's part of this formula, right? So we're going to do minus 8,000, which is going to give us $9,500. Now we're going to divide that by 100 hours worth of work. And throughput is now $95 an hour of throughput. So what's this saying? For every hour we deploy our crews, gross profit is telling me that I make better gross profit from the mowing than I do from the hardscape. Throughput is telling me I retain twice as much revenue per hour worked by doing hardscape work.
What is the gross profit calculation ignoring that the throughput calculation is considering?
The gross profit to bake into why does it work this way is typically this, because your markups on labor are high. So the markup on labor in this case is like 100, it's $25 an hour. We charge $50 an hour. That's roughly, right? It's like 100%. And so yes, some of that goes to overhead. That's why gross profit is gross. I didn't do net. It's gross profit. We still have to pay overhead out of that. But gross profit ignores the fact that labor has a really high markup and materials often doesn't have that high. If you double the price of your pavers, you probably aren't going to win any paver job. There isn't that room in the market to do that. So then it looks and says, oh, you make a lot of profit on labor. You make a little bit of profit on materials. So mowing's better because it's all labor. So you got this high gross profit there. But everybody knows instinctively that doesn't feel right. And so then you have to use your gut and your human intuition to say, well, that doesn't, but throughput just puts it in plain English. It says, no, it's $95 an hour of throughput. That's how much revenue the company's going to keep for every hour worked. And if our business, if the weakest link in the chain that runs our landscape company is the number of hours I can find people to work, then I need to maximize that number. And I'm going to maximize it by selling jobs that maximize as much materials as possible.
This is so interesting. Yeah. This is so helpful. I have questions. My brain's kind of going in a million directions, but before I sort of just assault you with follow-up questions, is there another diagram or another thing you want to explain here to just really color in the point?
I think there's the one more thing I wanted to just touch on too is when we look at things from a throughput lens, we look at opportunity. So at least my mind, when I look at those two things, jumps to, it's not that mowing is bad. It's just that I'm foregoing the opportunity to earn another $45 an hour, right? The difference between 50 for mowing and 95 for hardscape, if I put crews on doing this. And so to make it more about, maintenance, we can say that, let's just take two maintenance companies or two maintenance crews. We can say that, maybe I don't have a lot of materials because I do maintenance. So what does that mean to me? Well, it means that the jobs that you sell that have upsold services, enhancements like planting, like mulching, like chemical or pesticide applications, those are the jobs that are going to help you maximize your throughput per hour. And a job that's just mowing shouldn't be there. Now, if I looked at all my jobs and just said, well, just generate me a printout of the gross profit of all my jobs, those mowing only jobs might look good. They might even be in your top 25. But what I'm saying is they are an inefficient waste of your most important resource. And if you don't have a problem finding labor, then you're probably right to go with gross profit. Just like go throw as many crews out there as you can at 50% gross profit. You're going to be fine. But if you do have a problem with labor, we need to look at the opportunity. And the other thing about that, Benji, too, is like that gross profit is not even considering the fact, too. It just makes this assumption that we can grow labor at this rate. But what happens when you get to 3 or 4 people?
The gross profit goes down. Yeah, you start to lose some efficiency.
Yeah, I need more tools. So I have more costs in adding labor. It's not no cost to add labor. I have costs. And then what happens when you add 2 more trucks and 2 more trailers and 2 more? I need another manager in the office to run this. I need an accounting clerk. So like this assumption that labor is just a truly variable cost, that's a problem here. Whereas again, if we focus on how much money is the business retaining per hour worked, we can get rid of a lot of that complication. We're just maximizing how much we have to work with.
If someone is watching along or listening along, the epiphany hopefully that they're having, or maybe they've had at some point already, and this is just clarifying it, it's pretty obvious. It's pretty salient. It's like, if we want to maximize for throughput per hour, and we may not, by the way, there might be other reasons based on our market, based on our long-term goals, based on the what we're optimizing for in our business. There may be reasons we're not going after throughput as aggressively, but if we are, the takeaway is pretty obvious. It's like, I want to stack as many jobs that have a high throughput per hour. I want to cram as many of those through my business as possible and do as few that are low throughput per hour as possible through my business. So it's safe to say this would help us prioritize what type of work we take on and pursue and hire for and train for, because not all jobs are made equal. Some are definitely better for our bottom line and better for our cash flow, and some are worse. So where my brain is going with this, and if I'm kind of skipping ahead, let me know, but I want to know what we should be doing functionally from a brand and marketing standpoint, a design and sales standpoint, a production standpoint, even a hiring standpoint, to help support the move towards going after these high throughput oriented jobs.
So great call. And to just emphasize what you said, or put you might not be throughput focused, but I can't think of very many examples where you wouldn't be. Let's just, to quickly talk about sales and marketing and all the other things that we just talked about. Like, if I maximize my revenue per hour worked, and if I build bigger jobs, I'm going to grow my company's revenue. And guess what I don't need? More office staff necessarily, more sales staff, a bigger shop, more equipment, like more managers, all these things. If we're more customer meetings, more customers, more people to handle my customers, the more I can get out of the jobs we have, the more efficient I'm going to be at every other area. It's a compounding benefit that I just want to make sure that lands. It's not just the job. It's like you start to grow your entire company bigger. This was like one of my favorite things about TBG. I taught a lot of contractors workshops, budgeting workshops, right? And so I can tell you from 5,000 contractors, the average thing that companies spend on overhead is somewhere between 20 to 30%. There are companies that spend more, and there are a few companies that spend less, but most companies spend about 20 to 30% of their revenue on overhead costs. When we were humming at TBG, I think our peak was 7 point something. So our overhead was completely, why? Because we're focusing on the jobs that absolutely maximize our throughput. So I think and then you look at how much money is there left over when you don't have to worry about an overhead that's a third of what a competitor is. Well, I can price cheaper. I can pay my staff better. I can equip our staff to the nines. We can always have a good equipment. We can pay our office staff really well and get some just crack office people, because we've got all this, where other people are spending maybe 25% on overhead. If we're at 7, we have like 18% more of every dollar earned to spend on those things I just mentioned than the competitor, which means I'm going to beat you up on price. I'm going to have better people. I'm going to have better equipment. It's very hard to compete with a company that runs on that level of efficiency.
How should business owners begin putting this into practice? Like what is implementing this philosophy look like? Are there tactical moves they can make tomorrow? Like let's make this, let's build a bit of a roadmap for people to take this lesson, which you've illustrated beautifully, and actually put it in place in their companies.
Awesome. So to do that, I just got to throw a diagram up on the vibe board about the theory of constraints and like where do we start and how do we go through this cycle? And the first slot on the theory of constraints in any system, in any company, is identify the bottleneck. Now, on this conversation, you and I have assumed that we know the bottleneck, it's labor. Maybe yours isn't. I'm assuming it's going to be labor, but it might not be. But the first step would be identify. Now, let's say, for example, and for the purposes of this, it's labor. So we'll move on to the next stage. And the next stage is called exploit. And exploit means, how do we get the most out of the bottleneck that we have? How do we exploit the constraints of whatever our limiting factor is to get the most out of it? And in this case, it would be maximizing the revenue retained. And so the easiest way to deploy what we've been talking about is, when I sell jobs, I should look at the throughput per hour. That is a number that I should focus on, because it's telling me how much revenue the business is keeping for every hour we work on a job. So go through our past jobs. If I've got a maintenance, portfolio of 300, 500 clients, great. Put them all in a spreadsheet. And again, so easy. Put them all in a spreadsheet. Put the revenue down there. Put what you spent on materials for those jobs, and then divide by the number of hours you worked on those jobs. If you have any system like LMN or similar, you're going to be able to do that fairly simple. Dump it to a spreadsheet, calculate that. Then stack rank those jobs. Then set your benchmark to get to sales and marketing, right? So once we have a benchmark, and benchmark might be half, you might even say, well, it's the upper third we actually want to get everybody into. Great, fantastic, whatever that is. What do those customers look like? That becomes our marketing, right? So these jobs are the kind of jobs, these neighborhoods are the kinds of neighborhoods that we make the most throughput per hour. So that's the kind of jobs I want to market to. That informs how we do our website. That informs the neighborhoods we go market at. It informs, the messaging it might even inform our pricing and packaging. Like, we don't have packages that just do mowing. We just do this. That's pretty common.
It's also going to give the sales team, you can think of if you do the exercise that you just described, where you're finding the top third and establishing a benchmark. This is a really easy rule of thumb to add to whatever your sales team or estimation team is doing. It's like, you just put together a proposal, and there's one final check at the end, which is like, after you've tallied up all your costs and added some margin and put together a proposal that's client facing, you also just go, oh, let me just quick math this, let me see if this is hitting the throughput per hour threshold that we decided is what good looks like. And that is not complex math. That's actually easier than the estimate in the first place.
100%. Easier than gross, easier than net profit, easier for people to understand. Like, most salespeople don't understand net profit because there's a whole bunch of numbers they're not allowed to see, which is fine. This abstracts a lot of that complexity and just makes it simple. And also, when I go to put a bid out and it's under our threshold, what do I need to do? Well, very quickly, you're going to learn what things are high throughput per hour activities. And it could be mulching. It's definitely going to be planting, lighting, irrigation, whatever. So even if I have a job that is below the threshold, as a salesperson, it's going to be pretty quick and easy for me to say, I need to be able to add and sell these services in order to get up to this benchmark.
Cool. Okay, so after identify and exploit, what's next?
The next one's subordinate, which is basically like, get rid of things that require the labor. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. It's not that relevant to landscape contracting, but I do want to move to elevate. So elevate's the fourth step of the process. And that looks at like, how do we get the most out of our bottleneck? So whereas exploit might be, let's look at our jobs and let's pick the ones that are highest revenue per hour, or if you're a maintenance, and that, like, that's equally good for maintenance or construction, but maintenance can also start looking at that at a bigger scale. So can construction, right? What does throughput per hour look like in a month? How much work do we need to get through in a month? For maintenance, it might be, what's our throughput per day on a route? Now we're looking at how much revenue we get with drive time and all that kind of stuff baked in, because we're back to hours again, right? We're going to say, okay, it's an 8-hour route or 10 hours or whatever you're working. This is our revenue. How does it stack up to our throughput per hour? And it's pretty simple to calculate. That's exploit. As we get a little bit further down the chain, we want to maximize that stuff, because that stuff's free, right? We can maximize that stuff for free. We just need to change the way we sell and work. When we get to elevate, we want to look at what are the things that we can do to labor to make it more productive. One is we can equip them with the best possible equipment that they can do. So one of the things that we introduced at TBG was bigger trucks that could carry more materials and carry more crews and be more efficient that way. So we didn't have to make multiple trips for delivering or hauling out. We equipped every crew with a skid steer and an excavator. So again, from an accounting perspective, it's like, oh, it's another, $2,000 in lease per month for these crews. But if you look at it like, yeah, and a really simple way to look at this is like an excavator. Let's say a mini excavator is $1,000 a month for a lease. Arguably, maybe it's $1,200 or whatever. We use 1,000 for just a simple math. $1,000 a month. The average revenue produced by a single installation crew member is about $150 an hour. Now, again, just to make sure I'm not confusing anybody, that's not the rate of labor. That's the rate of labor plus the materials they would install. The average is about 150. So it could be 125, could be 175, depending on the work, but it's in and around there. So if you look at the average value of labor at $150 per person per hour, then if an excavator costs you $1,000, how many hours do you need to save? Well, it's like 4.5. If we said the value of an hour is $150 an hour, then an excavator needs to save you about 4.5 or half a day of one person's time in order to help pay for that excavator. And so that's why we went to this makes total sense. These costs just ramp up dramatically our ability to churn out jobs quicker, right? Machines to unload every material that's on there, excavators to dig properly, excavators with grading things so that we dig properly, and it just makes everything more efficient. So equipment's a big one. The other big one I would say is good labor. So one of the things we found, which is an inversion of what you might hear from a lot of people, is we found as we paid more for crew leads, we got a lot more work done. And so we stopped necessarily focusing and hyperfixating on the wages that we were paying people. Instead, we started hiring people at significantly higher wages than we were used to, but we started attracting people from other trades, good tradespeople that could run a job. And the value of running a job, the value of we're paying maybe $5, $10 an hour more at that time for this tradesperson. But think of all the ways they're maximizing the crew's efficiency that day. They're planning better. They're loading better. They're telling the crew what they need to get done every day. They're managing the crew better. They're training the crew better. They set a better culture. They take better care of the equipment. Like all these things for 10 grand a year, 15 grand a year, think about that. 15 grand a year is one small landscaping job in a year. If you can get a good person to do that, it's going to make sense, but not necessarily if you're just focused on net and gross profit. You're nervous to pull the trigger on those things.
So this is a really interesting point here I want to slow down on, because this is Pareto principle at work. Like, I'll give you a few examples, guys. 20% of the superstars in the NBA score all the points. 20% of the football players score all the touchdowns. When you look at how things are distributed, there's a universal law which says, another good example is like all of the mass of the planets in the solar system are made up by a very, very select few actual celestial bodies. I'm getting a little scientific here. What's my point? A really, really, really good tradesperson is not a little bit better than an average tradesperson. They're not even quite a bit better, 50% better than an average tradesperson. they are a full order of magnitude. It's like don't add a percentage, it's like add an exponent. Like they are all so much better than someone else. And so you hear this across the trades and blue collar economy in every industry. The smart builders, for example, pay for the most expensive carpenters because that most expensive carpenter is 40% more than an average carpenter, but they output 3x or 5x. And I don't think that people see that clearly enough in their businesses until they do. And then this lesson becomes self-evident and they literally can't see it any other way.
I think you're spot on. To draw your sports analogy, right? Shaq makes people focus on the paint so that you get better outside shots. Curry does the opposite. He'll take your outside shot. Yeah, now you got to respect that. It's not just Curry or Shaq. They're awesome and they're going to get you your 25 points a game. It's that everybody else now has better shooting opportunities because those people elevate the same. That's why they get paid all that money. If you look at the NBA or any other sports team, we're not even talking about 3 to 4x magnitude. We're talking about 5 to 10% more scoring a game. Maybe it's 2%, but it's worth those millions of dollars because, obviously there's all that ticket revenue and everything for that. But that incremental improvement is not just that player you're adding. It's the way their ability to bring up all the players around them. And it's the same thing in landscape contracting. A good crew lead is usually the reason why most people quit. Like your crew leads often dictate your retention problems, but the training, the organization, the way they teach people how to work, the way they work, they're not just a $5 an hour investment extra in them. It's an investment in your entire crew and making them more productive. And when you look at like what they could do in a year versus what a low cost, unmotivated crew lead would do in a year, it's not even close. It's not necessarily that we're saying they'll do 4x revenue in an entire year, but even if they were to do 20%, when you're talking about a crew that does $400,000 a year in revenue, this crew does 480. And what are you going to pay that foreman? A little bit extra, 10 grand, 20 grand extra all day long for that, because that's 60 more in my pocket as an owner.
Are there any other things that you would add to this sort of like elevate conversation? You talked about new equipment. We've talked about getting just better labor, getting better people in the field. Is there anything else that we do to elevate our throughput?
Sure. I mean, sub out work that's not that profitable, right? So, for instance, we would, for a lot of our hardscape stuff, and this isn't necessarily, this is what you should do, but this worked for us. We would subcontract the laying of pavers. We would go in, excavate everything, grade it, mark it perfectly. And we had subs that came in for very reasonable prices that knew what they were doing, did really good work, and they just laid the pavers. Why? Because we looked at our throughput per hour on laying pavers and it wasn't that great. So great, we'll do that. That's another example of how you could elevate it. You could apply subs to the situation to do that. The type of work that you sell is also a huge one. Learning to say no to work that isn't high revenue per hour. But how do you teach a salesperson not to sell mowing when we look at the gross profit example that you and I just looked at and say, well, gross profit's 50%, our overhead's 30%. This is like whatever profit at the end of it. It's hard when those are the only numbers you look at. When we look at this, it makes things a little more clear why we might want to do more.
That might be one of the bigger ones because it's the most upstream. If you can take this lesson and apply and give yourself a new lens and sort of stack rank the type of jobs that you like versus don't like, pretty quickly it's like, okay, well, how do I steer this ship? And ultimately what's kind of the motor at the front is your marketing engine. So how do I steer the marketing engine and then the sales process that follows so that I'm filling the hopper with more of these types of jobs and less of those types of jobs? And we should probably do a whole separate episode on how to orient your marketing and sales team for this, because there'll be a lot to talk about there. But just if we're trying to give people fundamental principles to think about, that type of work concept is very upstream as a part of this whole process.
Yeah, you're spot on. I type of work, whatever. And then to your point, that starts leading into tentacles of like, great, what does our website look like? And we talked about it earlier. Who am I selling and where am I selling to? And how are we presenting ourselves? And what are we looking like from a brand perspective? All that kind of stuff dictates the type of work that's going to fall to you, which is going to dictate how high your throughput is at the tip of the spear, if you will.
Anything else you want to cover here?
And then the last thing is, and then at the end of that, we'll repeat. Now, for some companies, your repeat changes, right? For the assembly line example, let's say I say, yeah, this is wrong. We should invest in a new painting booth that can do 200 frames an hour. Great, we'll do that. So then what? Well, we're looking up at that example. I've got a new bottleneck now. If I change my paint now to 200, now my new bottleneck is the body assembly, right? And so we're going to focus, how do I get as many bodies through the assembly line as possible? Because no longer is the paint. So now if we get to a point where labor isn't a biggest constraint anymore, we could do something perhaps different. I don't meet too many contractors who've solved the labor problem in this sense, but it's always important to realize it is a cycle. And so the repeat doesn't necessarily mean that labor is not your problem anymore. It could just be like, once you realize there's a new level of throughput per hour you get to, maybe that number goes up. Like I remember Mark in many years saying, we're not going to sell jobs anymore that are less than this. Okay, new number for this year. And out we go. And we kept making it happen over time, and we kept growing that number. So the repeat is about re-looking back at your results and setting new goals. And if we now know throughput and we go out and sell a bunch of new jobs that are of a higher throughput, and then we realize like, wow, 50% of our jobs are up at this new higher thing, it's going to become a lot more realistic to say, well, if we did that, why can't we get more jobs now to this upper crust of throughput? And we can repeat that over and over until we hit that conceptual limit.
This is such a powerful lesson. If we take a big step back from throughput, and I want to ask you just a more general question to close. How do we as business leaders develop a better eye for efficiency? What kind of mental shifts do we need to make? What type of data should we start looking at more closely? What type of data maybe should we start looking at less closely? This eye that I'm talking about, this lens for efficiency, is something that is developed over time. And I wonder if you've got any helpful advice to close for people who want to develop it faster.
It's a really good question. I think my double answer, the first answer would be like, we need to look at data in the light of labor, meaning when we do look at things, and maybe it's profit, maybe it's gross profit, whatever, but let's look at that per hour worked, right? Let's look at our gross profit dollars per hour worked. Let's look at our net profit dollars per hour worked. We've talked all day about throughput per hour worked. I think running everything through the filter of labor is what's going to help us grow our company as big as possible while maintaining as little as possible labor. And that will have all kinds of benefits, right? Again, growth and whatever. That's one thing. I think that the point in between the lines there is, to your question, is like being non-negotiable at collecting accurate data. I think that's what a lot of contractors struggle with. Well, my people aren't good with this, or they don't fill out their paperwork, or they don't do that. Those contractors that let that happen are going to be at the mercy of not knowing the things that we're talking about today, and not ever being able to look back and stack rank their jobs and do any of this kind of stuff. And so we'll middle around in that sort of average profitability, or sometimes often even below average profitability. They just don't have the numbers to say, hey, this is what we should be doing. If you don't have these numbers, you can't turn to your sales team and say, only sell jobs to this. You can't look at a crew lead and say, this is what I expect at the end of the year in terms of our throughput to be. And if you beat this, we can have a bonus. One thing we didn't talk about this is like, this was like the foundation for an entire incentive system for us, that paid crews bonuses based on the revenue, throughput in this case, that they earned. There's all kinds of good stuff to that. But I would say like, you have to just be, the data is as important as getting the job done. Because if we get a job done and we don't learn anything, maybe we shouldn't even have done the job. The only way we're going to learn something is if we have some results to look at. And it doesn't mean all our jobs are going to go well. But, we sat in a meeting recently with Mark, who said the same thing. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to set a plan that doesn't work. If we don't have the numbers to support or back that plan, or have the metrics that said, this is what we thought was going to happen, and this is what did, then shame on us, because we're just going to make that mistake over and over and over again. We have to be able to learn. The only way we're going to learn is with metrics.
It's like our friend of the show, Isaac Barlow, he says, your first job is to bring me good data, and your second job is to do your job. And I think that's a really good mantra to live by. Very clean, very concise. Mike, this has been an absolute masterclass. Can't thank you enough. We will do this again soon.
Love it, Benji. Thanks.